want to build on what I've told you in the last two videos about figured bass, and we've looked specifically at figured bass for root position and for seventh chords, and today I want to cover some of the conventions for the use of figured bass. We've talked about where a particular set of figures exists to show you exactly what intervals above a bass note you may need in order to create a certain chord, and that is still going to be the basic principle. But in order for figured bass to be applicable in any situation, there are a few additional pieces of information you need to know and a few conventions that have emerged over time that you also need to be aware of. So let's start with the additional information, then we'll move on to the conventions. The additional information is really fairly logical and perhaps obvious. You can add to any figure a flat or a sharp or a natural, and those will then apply to that particular interval, that particular note. So if you look over here, I have here a bass note C, and I have the figures 5-3. We know 5-3 means that this is a root position chord. We also know that the key signature would apply, so this would normally create a 5-3 chord. 1, 2, 3 gives me the note E. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gives me a G. That creates a C, E, G chord. And the key signature that we currently have would suggest that it's C, E natural G. However, for whatever reason, in this particular composition, the E needs to be flat. So the composer has written flat 3. So we simply say, okay, I've got 5-3, but I've got 5 flat 3. Which creates, in this case, a C minor chord. Now there could be a whole host of reasons why that chord needs to be minor in that particular moment, in that particular context. And you'll have to figure out why it's minor, whether that's a borrowed chord or a secondary dominant or whatever it might be. That is for you to figure out. The figured bass just tells you that instead of having a whatever type of third you would normally come up with when you count up with the key signature, you've got to put a flat in front of the third above the bass. It's the third, of course, above the bass. All of these numbers are above the bass. Just in the same way, so you might have a sharp applying. So this would mean you'd have, say, 5-3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but now the fifth is sharpened. So you would have C, E, G sharp. It would become a C augmented triad. Perfectly fine. There would maybe a context in which you would come across that need to use that. The natural can be used to cancel out something that's in the key signature. Let's say you have a chord in C minor, and again we have the C chord with 5 and this time natural 3. So now you count up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the 3 has a natural, so this now becomes C major chord in minor. There could be any number of reasons why that might happen. The point is, what is in front of the figure applies to that interval distance above the bass note. And you put that in and take it into account when you're figuring out what chord you have to deal with. Like all figured bass, this doesn't tell you where to put those notes. It just tells you the notes that you are dealing with in that chord. Now, there's one other thing that you need to know that's additional information, and that is you can have a figure with a slash through it. You see this sideways slash cutting the note, cutting the figure, kind of like it's cutting it in half. That means that you raise that note, again, that interval distance. So let's look here. We have 5/3. So again, we count up. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the 3 has a slash through it. So we raise that interval distance. This is an F natural. It says to raise it, so we raise it to F sharp. And that is the correct interpretation of this figured bass. Now, I would emphasize, this is to raise. It is not to sharpen it, it's to raise it, which means in a situation like this, where we have the key signature of B flat major in place, and we have this chord, C, with 5 and /3 under it, we go through the same basic principles. We count up 3, 1, 2, 3, We count up 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is C, E flat, because of the key signature, G. But the third has a slash. The third is to be raised. So we get to this E flat and we raise it by making it natural. So the slash is a little bit more generic. It means to raise, and that might mean putting a sharp, or it might mean putting a natural if the note is already flat in the key signature. So raising that interval distance is important when you see the slash, and it is important you understand that it means to raise, not just to sharpen. It means to raise it, which might mean taking a flattened note and making it natural. Now, that's the new information, that's the additional information. Now the conventions, what you need to know about the convention of how we use figured bass leads us to this part of the board. When you were writing triads, it soon became apparent to individuals using figured bass that they were going to write hundreds of root position triads, and they were going to be constantly writing 5-3 underneath their root position triads. If every time they wrote a root position triad they had to write 5-3, 5-3, 5-3, 5-3, that would become very tedious. Equally, they write, after root position chords, they wrote probably more first inversion chords than anything else. So you've got a ton of root position chords and then a lot of first inversion chords. And they would be constantly writing 6-3, 6-3, 6-3, 6-3, and of course that becomes tedious. The same is true with the seventh chord. If you had to write, every time you write a root position seventh chord, you have to write 7-5-3. It will become very, not only tedious, not only time consuming, but a great deal of ink would be being put on the paper. So, they came up with conventions. They just decided, if you have a bass note and it has no figures under it, we will assume it is root position and the figures would be 5-3. If you have a bass note and you want it to be in first inversion, we'll just put 6. We won't put the 3. So if this was going to be a first inversion chord, you'd have the correct bass note for the first inversion chord and just a 6 underneath. And that would mean, you know that that would actually mean 6-3, and you would count up accordingly. You'd find it's a C major first inversion chord. If you're going to do a second inversion chord, and we don't write many second inversion chords, we'll put the full figures in, 6-4, exactly what you would expect. So no figures root position, just a 6, you'll assume 6-3, 6-4 is the full figures. For the seventh chord, the same basic principle applies. If you want to write a seventh chord, just write the 7. Don't worry about the 5-3. If you see just a 7 under a note, you assume it's a 7-5-3 root position chord. If it's first inversion, just write 6-5, don't put the 3. That way if you see 6-5 under a note, you know it's a first inversion 7th chord. For second inversion, 4-3. For third inversion, 4-2. So for 7th chords, it's 7 or 6-5 or 4-3 or 4-2. And that's for root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. The other notes are there, you still need to know they exist. You have to be able to add them in a sense, and count them up. But what you're going to see in the music are these shorthand versions, where some of the figures are in place to tell you it's a first inversion or it's a second inversion chord. Some of them have been dropped out because it became tedious to write them all the time. So the convention is that certain figures appear all the time, certain figures are dropped out and don't appear, but they are implied. They are still there, they're just not written. And you need to know when a chord is implying that there are figures, and when obviously a chord is written. You'll actually know when there are numbers written in, you will count those, but know that those may not be the only numbers that you need to create the chord. So you do need to learn what are the full figures, 7-5-3, 6-5-3, 6-4-3, 6-4-2, so on, the full figures, but you also need to know what are the figures that are dropped out and the figures that always appear. What is the difference between the conventional use and the full figures if you were writing them all out all the time? And you should know the difference between those two. So, this is new information that you need to be aware of. This is a kind of re-looking, a reworking of some of the information we already covered. Make sure you're clear on all of that. If you have any questions, bring it to class. Make sure you're clear on that, because what you'll start to see is these figures showing up on the homework, and they will be implying that certain chords need to be written. You should be able to write those chords down accurately from the figures you are given. Thank you. Oh, I realized that in the last video I had mentioned everything about figured bass you needed to know except one thing. So I'm adding this quick addendum on the end of the last video just to point out one more piece of information you need to know. It is possible for an accidental in figured bass to appear on its own underneath a note. Now, we already know that if the accidental is immediately in front of a number, then it applies to that interval above the bass. So here we have flat 3. We know that the only figure we have is a 3, so we can assume that it is a 5-3 root position chord. Otherwise, if it was a first inversion or something else, we'd need more figures. So with just a 3, it's a 5-3 chord. So we come over here, we count up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we remember that the third above the bass is flat, and we would add that in. Now, if you have an accidental on its own, then the accidental on its own applies to the third above the bass. It's very important that you remember it is the third above the bass. It will be tempting for you to sometimes think that it means the third of the chord. And sometimes the third above the bass is the third of the chord, but sometimes it is not. So the rule, if you will, is that an accidental alone applies to the third above the bass. Now that would be, for example, in this situation here we have the note with just the accidental, so we know that this means that the third above the bass must be flattened. It must also be a 5-3 chord. We'd need more figures if it was anything other than a root position chord. So we count up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we apply the accidental to the third above the bass. In other words, this is a shorter way of writing that. When you just have the fact, it simply means the same as that. It could be sharp, it could be natural, any accidental on its own applies to the third above the bass. Just to prove my point about it being the third above the bass and not the third of the chord, if we look at this one, here we have sharp 6, sharp, over an A, or underneath an A. And so when we look at this, we would say to ourselves, well, we understand sharp 6, that's telling us that the interval of a sixth above this note is sharpened. But what does the sharp on its own mean? Well, a sharp on its own and an accidental on its own applies to the third above the bass. So we also know that this is essentially saying sharp 6, sharp 3. That's really what it's saying, because the accidental applies to the third above the bass. It's the same as writing something like this. So we would work that out. We would count up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We would make the sixth sharp. We would make the third above the bass sharp. Now this is not the third of the chord. In this chord, which is a 6-3 chord, it's a first inversion chord, the bass note is the third of the chord. This is an F sharp minor chord. But the third above the bass is sharp to make the chord work. So what you need to remember from this is that A, accidentals can appear on their own under a note, and B, when they do, that accidental applies to the third above the bass note. And if you remember those two things, then you'll be in good shape. And that's the last piece of information, I hope, that you need to know for figured bass right now to be able to proceed into the rest of the videos. Thank you.